we'll try and make sure that you have gone through some of the text so that you can participate well in the class. I think before I go to the outline and everything, let's just go straight to the Padlet because I do want some engagement. Awesome. So, so I think I can ask a few of you to just raise your hand if you're interested in sharing what you have written, and maybe I can call on a few. I think I found one of them really, like some of them really interesting because I hadn't at least read about them in such detail. But just scrolling through for people to see what was submitted, because this time I didn't allow you to see everyone else's post. Okay, so I'm going to park the Indus dolphins because it's going to appear in the post. I'm going to park some species because I'll be asking you to categorize them based on, towards the end of the presentation, like I'll ask you which particular category these species belong to. But let's see who's raised their hand and if we can call on someone. Bakhtavar, do you want to go first?
So, Assalamu alaikum. So, Indus River dolphins are the world's most endangered species in the freshwater dolphins. And due to increasing changes in climate, the UV radiations and all of that has been affecting their habitats, their prey, whatever the food they eat, because obviously that they are also seawater species. So it has been affecting the dolphins in such a way.
Okay, and someone had posted coral reef. So I don't know which one was that. Thank you, Tower. If you just want to unmute and speak, because it'd be nice. Speaking of the oceans and the water and life below water, I think coral reefs play such an important part. So whoever has posted this, if you can please unmute and speak. Okay, if we don't have you around, let's just go to the other species that I wanted to discuss in the class. It was this one, the Balochistan mouse. I've forgotten the name, but like the Balochistan dormouse, forest dormouse. Shireen, are you around?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay, so basically I was reading about this, and it's basically a very species of rodent that's going extinct because of deforestation in the juniper forest of Ziyarat in Balochistan. And the deforestation is happening because like what we talked about last time, there's some sort of juniper tree mafias who are just cutting down the junipers to sort of take it to other places in Pakistan to sell it illegally over there. And also because the people near the Ziyarat, in the Ziyarat area, don't really have a lot of other fuel in the winters. So they use the juniper forest as firewood. And also the juniper forest in the Ziyarat forest are like some of the oldest trees in the world. So even in that, um, just because we're cutting them down, there's going to be so much loss of wildlife, especially these ones. They're nearly going extinct because of the rate of deforestation.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing the story, because now you can see that it's not just one species that's something that we'll discuss. It's not just one species that's going extinct, but the relationship that it has with another bio or life in that particular sphere. And it's because of their dependence upon, let's say, one on the other. So if if deforestation has mainly to do with the trees, but automatically that would wipe out the population of a certain species that would reside or had that as home. And we'll try to look at this as we go through the course. So do not worry, we'll come back to this Padlet towards the end of the class as well, when we talk a little bit about conservation and conservation biology. But let's just jump to the slides and start with a story that I share in the class generally because it relates to my childhood. So basically, like when I was young, when we used to go around in Gilgit, there were these so the channels don't have water in winter because no one's really practicing agriculture, but whatever water there is because of rain, and later like towards spring, those water bodies or that stagnant water serves as a breeding ground for a lot of frogs. And so in certain times in the channels, we would see a lot of tadpoles, like so many of them, that you can't imagine. It was like magic seeing so many tadpoles just breeding and growing into the frogs. But as I was growing up, that wasn't the case anymore. Like we couldn't see that many tadpoles. And I think this is true for many other areas of Pakistan as well. And of course, I was wondering why that is. And I wouldn't ask you why that is, and I'll quickly come to why are amphibians actually vanishing across the planet. And if you look at some of the causes, they are diverse. And if you look at it in a greater detail, they are anthropogenic. Most of them are caused by us human beings, and that's why we're sitting here trying to understand not only the life, the biodiversity, and today specifically, as we focus on the biosphere, the sphere of environment where all life resides, let us have a look at why is it important for us as environmentalists. So some of the causes, for example, include we have fragmented their homes. They don't have bigger area to live on, to thrive. We have demolished their homes, so they don't have that habitat for them to live. We basically just invade more and more land, more and more space. And of course, climate change, which then eventually leads to both natural and man-made activities that causes an increase and changes the weather pattern. But a lot of diseases, just like we face a lot of diseases with changes in temperature, with changing conditions, it gives spaces to other parasites and of course with pollution. If you remember like some of these amphibians, particularly these smaller ones that come out when it's raining or when the conditions are, so if you see like one of the conditions, prolonged droughts, right? Because they need more moist conditions, they need like a water body for them to, even under the ground, for them to like tunnel and move around. And so the basic purpose of bringing this on was that even the introduction of the non-native species, the hunting, a lot of it has to do with human activities. And today at several points in the lecture, I'll remind you of why these species are extinct. And of course, when I showed you the evolution of life, I also showed you how extinction has happened naturally as well because of conditions, and mass extinctions have happened because of changes in the historically. But we'll come back to how, because of our presence on planet Earth, that cycle has become very, very abrupt. So there are like a couple of case studies again ahead of this as well. And thank you, keep writing your comments in the chat box. I hope I'll take some of them as we go ahead. But before we talk about the biosphere, the sphere of life, you remember that I told you that for sustainability and particularly in environmental sciences, the three interdisciplinary principles are the nutrient cycle, which we'll talk about, the solar energy and all the power that comes from it, because it's then converted into various other forms of energy, and biodiversity. So today we focus on biodiversity and we focus on the biosphere. And what I really find fascinating is that there are, more than 7.5 million species on the planet that are yet to be identified. So I think it's a huge area, unexplored area for a lot of biologists to just think that, we think that all the science is being done, but actually there's so much that hasn't been discovered, that hasn't been done yet. And that I hope that it gives a lot of people the motivation to want to explore, to want to know the planet better. Yes, Asad.
Ma'am, इधर भी जिस तरह एक estimate दिया हुआ है कि 8.7 million species are unidentified, right? और फिर उसके बाद आप अक्सर ये भी सुनते हैं इस तरह के claims कि जिस तरह, for example, 90% of the sea is undiscovered yet. So I was just curious, like, how do we make these assumptions? Like, हम वो कैसे मतलब estimate करते हैं? Sorry, because that's not something which I've quite understood. Because अगर हमें मतलब अंदाजा है कि 90% like अभी unexplored है, so doesn't that mean कि it's like a pretty reliable अंदाजा? मतलब हमें फिर we already know कि क्या सीन है, नहीं? Like
Yeah.
it's not really an estimate for it.
Yeah, I think it's true for a lot of numbers that we put for anything, to be honest. Like, how do we eventually then look at the credibility? And we will talk about in environment, particularly jo aajkal sare terms of net zero carbon and net zero emission, and how industries and these bigger capitalist organizations get away with these terms by, doing, so for example, extracting water from somewhere and then treating water somewhere else and then saying we're actually a net zero because we're giving more water back to the community than we are extracting. So a lot of these numbers are dodgy in general when it comes to environmental sciences, but with numbers like these, there is a lot of research that has come. And I think most of this is based on fossil records. So, when we date it back, and there are a lot of instruments available in the lab that have done that. We'll talk a little bit about how the electromagnetic radiations are used. So, for example, even about the structure of Earth. So last year, someone asked me, how do you know that's what Earth looks like? And that's what the core is like. So there are a lot of techniques, scientific techniques available, and most of them are based on the electromagnetic radiations, on what they absorb and what they release. And in terms of biology and biodiversity, most of these estimates are based on the fossil records for predating. And then for a certain guess on species. So for example, there are a lot of areas in the ocean, let's say in the benthic zone, which is, we can't really go there. Life has been found there too. And we do not know how to characterize those particular organisms. So we know they're there, right? So for example, I'll give you an example of bacteria. Like I work with microbiology, and I take an environmental sample in. So for example, I'll take a soil sample in, I'll bring it to the lab, I'll dissolve it in water, and I will plate like a certain amount of that water onto the plate. But even there, we say that only a certain number of species can really come and manifest in the plate. And the reason being that some bacteria may not like the food that we give them, which is nutrient agar. Some bacteria may not want to grow in the first day. They like to grow when it is day 15 and when the nutrient is less. Some bacteria may not like the other species, just like we have a certain behavior. It's again like those terms like competition. So for example, if bacteria like to compete with one another and one is more dominant, you would find more of them on the plate than the bacteria that is shy and would like to stay away. So that bacteria will not come out until it has the space and until the dominant species has given it the space. So there's like all these interesting things that happen. And we say that, like I said, for all the bacteria that there are, only a very small percentage is plateable or manifests itself on the plate, which means we have to go for advanced techniques, which people are going for now. So the PCR that you get to hear of, now people use different genetic, so different primers. So from that gene code, they would try and find the bacteria. But for the bacteria that we do not know, we cannot think of how to identify them. So they're like, those techniques have to evolve as well, right? Yes, Hania. So I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a lot of science behind it. Yes, Hania.
Yeah, ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. So, ma'am, you were just mentioning how some bacteria are shy and some have like different food preferences. Do they have like their species have some sort of personalities and stuff? Could you like tell more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, for example, I have taken, let's say, plastic sample out of the Mahmood Tuti dump site in Lahore, and I bring it and I plate it on the bacteria, right? And a certain kind of bacteria show on the plate, which is a nutrient agar plate, which is genetically used in the lab. Now, because there are different types of bacteria, as you know, in the first 6 to 8 hours, they make millions of copies. But that cannot be true for every bacteria, right? So like I said, some bacteria are fastidious. By fastidious, I mean they only grow, they only come out when there is very little food. So like they have their cycles as well. When there's abundant food, when there's a certain condition, those bacteria will show up. And when, for example, some people say that there are bacteria in the lava, and that's there. So in the most extreme of temperatures, there are bacteria that exist. And then there are bacteria that are found in ice environments. So if you try and identify that bacteria in the lab, yes, thermopolis is the term. So if you try and identify that bacteria here, and similarly like oxygen conditions, right? So in oxic conditions, you'll have certain kinds of bacteria grow, but in anoxic conditions, you'll have different kinds of bacteria grow. And all of those methods haven't been optimized in the lab, to put it correctly. So we know there are a lot of them, but we do not know who they are. So I think there is that identification that still needs happening, and our scientific techniques need evolution as well. And there's a lot of progress on this, by the way. Of course, I'm talking very basic, but and a lot of being characterized and optimizing conditions are being optimized as well. And I'm sure this number is increasing. But for example, we say about Pakistan that a basic profile hasn't been created. So how many soil types in Pakistan have been taken to the lab, and how many species have been identified? So some of these countries even are so unexplored that, you know, all the research that we're relying on is Western research or research in the developed world. So we get to learn as we do things. And I know I'm spending a lot of time here, so I'll just jump back, and we can come back to this discussion if you have more questions on this. And maybe Drosham, who's a bio major, can help me answer some of your questions in the chat. Right, so why is biodiversity important? And I've highlighted some of the species here because, like we said, every species has a role to play, and every species depends on another species in the environment. So sometimes when one species goes extinct or one species is threatened, the trophic levels before it, so the species that feed on it or the species that it feeds on, their population is going to change. And there's a population balance that we need in you know, I see that someone mentioned alien species or invader species in the chat. Basically, for example, let's say that humans have, by trying to introduce newer exotic species in the water bodies, wiped out the indigenous amphibian species that existed there, because those species are more dominant, like we talked about the bacteria, and are more diverse because they can adapt to different conditions compared to the amphibians, who have lighter skins, who are very very sensitive to pollution in the environment, who are very sensitive to changes, who are very sensitive to the UV light. That cannot be the case for any species that you introduce. And for example, this is said about squirrels. Squirrels are very robust. Wherever you take them, they just go and take over, and have been called invasive species very often in certain environments. So, right, and so the purpose of putting it here was that if you take a certain species out, you take its role out. If you take a bee out of an environment, you take the pollination out of an environment, and if you take that out of the environment, you take the fruition and you know, the survival of that, the plant species that was only growing and regrowing because of the pollination would dwindle. And similarly, a fish that the polar bear was relying on, if the fish extinction goes, like if the fish species is threatened, then automatically the food sources, and imagine if all the other food sources that the polar bear has are decreasing, then automatically its population will decrease. But if the polar bear population is endangered, then all the population that it was balancing out, right? So by eating a certain species out, it was also keeping the population below balance. But if that predator, that top predator, is gone, then the population of that species will increase. And so the competition at that level will increase as well. So if we have lesser nutrients, then automatically they will fight. And if they will fight, eventually some of them will die, and some of them, you know, fight for resources, not really like in the WWF ring, but they will fight for those resources and eventually be threatened or go extinct. And that brings survival of the fittest. Behram, you know more biology than most biologists have known. Okay, so when we talk about that, and I put like one of the circles on a bacteria, the reason I put it there is we do not eat bacteria, right? But bacteria have such a crucial role in our life because they, like I said, they degrade species, and and that they, for example, otherwise we would just see waste piles. But bacteria and mushrooms or fungi are not the only species that contribute to decomposition. There are a lot of detritivores, and there are terms that are associated at different trophic levels, and I'll try and bring them up when we talk about energy and the trophic levels and energy flows. But it basically starts with beetles. So even there is this amazing relationship where the bigger species will try and make the environment suitable for the smaller species to come in and then take their space. And eventually you see that wooden powder that you see, which a tree log is decomposed to eventually. And I think, like, in terms of the time progression, in terms of the importance of every species, it is so important to know the importance of everyone. Otherwise, who would care about a termite or the existence of a beetle or a particular fungi? But when you know the role that they play in the environment, in keeping a balance in the environment, in bringing, because this also brings a lot of nutrients back to the environment. So remember those 3 principles of sustainability. Here, the biosphere and the biodiversity is actually contributing to a lot of nutrient cycling. So bringing those nutrients back to the soil that were important and were taken up by a tree. So that cycle is really important as well. And I hope that you can make those connections towards the end of this course, and I think a lot of you already are. A quick reminder on what we were studying in the last class of how life is also based on atom, and then, you know, the same hierarchy of animal cell, then forming tissue, then forming organs, then organisms, then a population, then a community, then an ecosystem. So ecosystem, like we said, is species residing in a certain space. So if you combine all the ecosystems in the world, which is like all the species, all the spheres, spaces, the biotic and abiotic parts of life, that is basically the biosphere. So, so welcome to this sphere that we'll be discussing today, which is not just the life found on the soil, but the life that is found in the air and the life that is found in water as well. And we looked at some of this in the initial Padlet discussion. Before we go further, I think there are a few terms that you need to know as well, because again, they come a lot in discussion, like in relation to biosphere. First is the habitat, and I'll talk a lot about the habitat. I'll keep saying that we've lost the habitat of that organism. It's basically where that organism lives, and that attributes to their survival. The niche is another term that you'll see. So for example, it's not then just about the habitat, but interaction of the organisms that are there. And so one benefiting from the other. So the juniper trees and the dormouse actually were creating a niche, and that forest was their habitat, right? An ecosystem is all of those, the habitats, the niche, and all the interactions between all the organisms. And now we can start thinking about, you know, like we said, the nutrients are flowing. The biosphere has a role in bringing the nutrients back. And for the survival of these biospheres, those nutrients are important. So we talked about the nutrients that we would need for our survival. And there are 17 essential nutrients, minerals and elements that we need. But 95% of them, as you can see, are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which we'll talk about in the biogeochemical cycles. Micro and macronutrients, yes, that's it. So the macro ones are the ones that we need in larger quantities, so they make the 95%. And the very teeny tiny ones like zinc, iron, they're all your essential elements, but they are micronutrients that you would need for your survival. And energy. So we talked about energy, and what is basically going on when we talk about matter to then biosphere is that matter is converting into life, right? So last time we just looked at matter converting into chemicals, into certain components of the environment and life on Earth. But in this lecture, we look more at matter converting into life, and that life then making a lot of important contributions to the well-being of this planet. And the planet that we see and the planet that we want to see thrive better. Because that biosphere actually is an indication of a healthy planet, right? So that's what it is. It's the more biodiversity you will see, the more you will understand the health of that particular environment. So we talked until atom, but we didn't really go as far as chromosomes or genes. And the animal cell that we saw, there's a nucleus in it, and you've all read it. So I think I'll just focus more on another aspect of it. And I know there are a lot of computer scientists in the class and you code, but there is a lot of information flow in nature as well. And I'll talk about information flow at this level and also information flow at another level. So for example, in this case, those nucleuses have chromosomes. That chromosome has a DNA, and that DNA has your gene. And we say that the gene of every individual is unique to them. So look at all the human beings in the entire universe and them being so diverse. So basically, we are a manifestation of the genetic code that our body has. So not only is there a matter flow, so not only is matter flowing for example, one food chain to the other, so one trophic level to the other. Not only is the energy flowing, so we'll talk a little bit about the energy, but the information is also flowing, right? So we are a lot of this genetic information is being passed on from one generation to the other, and then you see the diversity that you see. So in the biosphere, there's a lot of genetic diversity, and we'll get to the different components. So you looked at the function of a few species. Now we're talking about the genetic diversity of certain species, and that's directly related to the diversity of species in the ecosystem. And I just wanted to make reference back to the energy flow and the matter flow and information flow in general. So this will come back to, you just need to remember that plants use the solar light, the water, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to make their food, right? So energy is flowing from the solar energy, it's being converted into, let's say, chemical energy. And the plants use it later, they respire it for their day-to-day functions. So whether it's transpiration, whether it's growing up, it's actually that stored energy that's then being converted to carbon dioxide and water in the process of respiration. So just like a quick revision, because now we'll get to the energy flow. So why energy flows? How does energy flow in a biosphere, in a particular food chain, and then eventually in a food web? And why is it important? So you hold these thoughts as we progress into this, and I'll try for you to progress in it slowly. I just want you to keep this idea with you, because we'll talk about our consumption patterns of in terms of food later. And the consequences that it would have on the environment, specifically if we use later end up using a lot of fossil fuels in the process of food production, etc. And then the energy efficiency in general of these different trophic levels. So we all know, and this is probably like a basic food chain that we used to see, that out of all this energy that the sun provides, there's a very small amount, again, that is being fixed by the plant or used by the plant for food production. And that's through photosynthesis, of course. But a lot of the, let's say 99% of the heat is actually, or the solar energy is actually wasted, and only a certain 1% is fixed by the plants too, or the producers to create food. So they're the only trophic level that can produce their own food. And then, there's other trophic levels where we are, as primary consumers, or insect as primary consumers, or other species as primary consumers, rely on the producers to meet their food and energy demands. And then at the second trophic level, there would be, so they are herbivores, yes, and then at the second trophic level would be carnivores or meat eaters who would now only eat the insects. And then at the tertiary level, there would be the top carnivores, so something like the polar bear, which is important in keeping this population of the birds, the secondary carnivores, intact. And then, like we said, the detrivores then play a role in degrading any waste that is associated with it, so that everything is cycling back into its origin. So if you keep this idea in your head, let's now quickly look at, try and complicate. So I will not complicate it too much, but I want you to take this information away with you, right? So I will not, when we were looking at the iPad, we looked at how simple this model is, and I told you how complicated it can get. So we looked at energy flows, and we'll be looking at the very basics of it, but I want you to think of how complicated it gets, because similar flows can then be maintained for all the other things that are being cycled into the environment. So as every species, let's say the autotrophs, when a carnivore is, or let's say when an insect or a herbivore is feeding on it, we, by the way, are omnivores. So we, the species that eat both plants and meat. And that's why, so remember the diversity in food, and that's why we survive best, because our food is so diverse, right? We literally can eat anything for for survival. So let me finish this and then I can come back to Asad. So you have the autotrophs. I said that some energy is lost, and then at this particular level, the plants would respire, let's say for growth, for transpiration, whatever the process is. So not every energy that is fixed from the solar radiation by the plants will be available for the herbivore. So some energy will be lost to respiration, but some energy will also be lost to waste. Some energy will also be lost to decay. So for example, a leaf that comes off is basically a part of the energy that's been lost, and it would come down, and the D is for decay. So that would go in the decaying process, so in the detrival process. And then the feces or the excreta, in the case of plants, it's whatever the roots exude, right? So not every food. So if there's excess sugar, that the plant has, it would release it to the ground. So that is a waste for the plant. So the plant can release the excess sugar in the soil, and then other species or other bacteria that live around the root, in the root zone, can use it as a food. Fungi, for example, use that as a food. A lot of hyphae, they create a lot of roots and then work with plants to eat that up. So that happens to the herbivores, and as you go on, the same waste will be associated with at all levels, and then at all levels, more energy will be released in respiration. So my question would be, before I take Asad's question, what do you think about the efficiency of this process? Do you think that this process, which is like energy being fixed from here up till here, do you think that this process is energy efficient? And with this question, I'll let you think about the answer. You can use the chat box to answer the question, and then I can take Asad's question or comment if there is any.
So मैम मैं पूछूं? मैम मैंने पूछना था कि I read somewhere that anatomically humans have been like herbivores before they were omnivores. So मैं ये पूछना चाह रहा था, is this like something we evolved into, or were humans like हमेशा से omnivores थी?
I think we adapt as we live, right? So again, that inference was made from, of course, the records. So let's say our excreta in the fossil that was there, that showed that our diet was only herb. But actually most of the, if you look at the human history, most of the, like our introduction always is of hunters and gatherers, right? So we were always, I think, relying on this. And we, so the reason why, and I keep asking you this question of how did we become such powerful species? I think we became powerful species because we could adapt, because we could, for example, of how when the food got scarce, we domesticated the animals, we domesticated the plants, the wild plants. We no longer relied on how those wild plants would grow themselves. We engineered it, and we brought food security for ourselves. Imagine like for example, the dorm mouse doing that. Imagine the dorm mouse putting its own juniper tree in the forest. So that's like, unfortunately, that's not their ability, right? Although there are species, for example, that would take the seed, depending on the food they eat and where their feces are, they do transport seeds from one place to the other. And that's what naturally the evolution has taken place, or the spread has taken across. But I think we have become the powerful species because we have adapted to different food sources. And it's not just what existed then, but even now, if you look, there's a lot of discussion on eating insects for meeting our protein needs. I don't think any other species on the planet just says, we're running out of protein, or the protein that exists is very energy inefficient, so let's just switch to insects now because insects are a rich protein source. So I think that then helps us. Someone else has raised their hand. I don't know who that is, so I can take that question and maybe move forward with this discussion. Zain, is it you?
Yes, I wanted to add on the question that you asked about the energy efficiency. Ma'am, I think that on a spectrum of 100, it would be 5 to 20, but precisely I heard that it's about 10% efficiency, ecological efficiency. So ma'am, I wanted to know the reason. Is it just because at every trophic level, we are losing the energy in respiration to survive, and energy loss as a heat in cellular respiration, etc. So at every trophic level, we are getting a loss of energy, but still there is some transfer of energy from one trophic level to another trophic level. Is it that so, or is there any other mechanism involved in this energy transfer and energy efficiency?
Yeah, I think the more you look at it, the more you would, the more complicated it would get, right? But I think to simplify it, yes, as we show in here, for example, some of it still gets assimilated, right? That's why we take the food. So from the transfer of energy from a herbivore to, from an autotroph or a producer to herbivore is a little more efficient, because whatever was fixed from the solar energy, most of it is being assimilated. But then as you go up, and then you can see how our diet or the plates sort of spread as well, is unless it's like a rich source of food, then it would be compact. But generally it's all of those, and we need, like most of this, I think that by the respiration, I also maybe mean growth, because all of us are growing and all of us are creating newer cells and all of us are fighting. So remember in COVID how we were told to add so many more things into our diet because it would help immunity, or it would help us fight the disease, and automatically, like, we added so many more components into our food. And then all of them had certain roles to play. So in terms of energy, I think what we take and what we store, and some species are really inefficient as well. So some species will, for example, lose most of the energy, particularly if they're physically active, right? So yes, the snow leopard would rely on meat and you would expect it to, eat less, but because it's also like walking from one village to the other in search of food, you would also see it wanting more food. So I think that efficiency then comes down to that species as well, but most of it, I would say, Zain, is respiration or the need of the body of that particular species, and then the waste, right? So we have all of that excreta coming out. We have, for example, a lot of things that we shed, particularly, for example, in the case of trees, you shed leaves and then you grow more, so you would need energy for that, and that's taken up by, let's say, the solar light as well as the carbon dioxide that's present in the atmosphere. So you will continuously rely on them. And that inefficiency can be so much more complicated than this simple thing that I put on. Okay, so yeah, because there's later, like in your, not really homework, but there's an additional slide where I talk about the productivity, and as well as the biomass. I just wanted you to know that biomass is the dry weight of the organism. It's not the water content. So you take the water content out. And when we talk about biomass, it is the dry mass of the organism. So this efficiency that we're talking about, right? The energy pyramid is basically just thinning at the top, which means that you'll have most energy at the autotroph level and less energy at the secondary carnivore level. So yes, you're all right. It's very inefficient. The process is not efficient at all. Yes, Daniel.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask that even if the process is inefficient, like what other alternative do we have? Because these are inevitable processes. We have to do respiration in order to survive. So what direction are we going in? Like there is no alternative to this.
Yeah, there is no alternative to this, particularly for the species that are at that particular level, right? So for example, we can't expect a secondary carnivore to suddenly become vegetarian because the food that it takes is more energy inefficient. So that's like the process naturally. But I think this discussion is still important for species like us and for our dietary choice, because we have made choices, right? And we do have a choice between going for a more producer-based food or a more or staying going towards like a meat-based food or a dairy-based food. And that has implications on the planet, specifically when we produce food at the farm or at an industrial scale, because then the energy that's being wasted, as well as the energy that's being input artificially by us, as well as the waste that's being produced, all of that then increases in scale. So I'm not talking about the natural cycles. We're not criticizing anything that's there naturally. But this has a great relation to how we have adapted and how we have changed our current environments and our current reality. And I think I just want to, which is why I told you to just stay with this idea, right? Just keep it at the back of your head, because we'll keep coming back to this discussion of energy flows and what is more energy efficient and what is less energy efficient. But basically all of this discussion that we've had, I eventually wanted you to come to this discussion, which is the gross primary product and the net primary production. So all of this will eventually for us lead to a discussion on productivity, like how much of what we're taking on is actually productive. So as we said, an autotroph is more productive. And then as you go up, it will be less and less productive because they need more and they'll waste more and a lot of energy will go through. But and I've just put like for the net primary productivity, I've said that the gross primary productivity minus the respiration. So this is just for the at the autotroph level. But if you wanted to model it, if you wanted to think beyond it, now you will have you'll only have the A's combined as your gross primary productivity. So all the assimilations will be your gross primary productivity, all the respiration, all the decays, all the feces, that waste would be your R's, like the R's plus extra waste. And then this model just keeps on getting complicated. So I think I will not go as far as that, but I just want you to know that this energy balance is important, because then we need to think that for that ecosystem to survive, that's the amount of energy that we need. That's the amount of energy transfer that we need. And if we compromise on that, then the ecosystem would be compromised on as well. And the biosphere plays an important life in bringing that, like in creating that energy balance. Yes, Zainab.
Yeah, so you've written here that after like the autotrophs to a herbivore was apart, you've mentioned second law of thermodynamics. So is it because after this point, everything is so inefficient that you're losing more energy than you're taking in, and the net of the system is being disturbed? Is that why?
So I love so for example, like you would not bring the concepts of physics to biology that often, but I love bringing everything together. Like I think as an environmentalist, that is the point of doing this. So when we talk about the solar radiation being fixed, we say that, hey, energy cannot be created, right? So we know, so right now we're just looking at that principle in manifestation. The solar energy is there. We're not creating it. We're not destroying it. We're just transferring it from one form to the other. So from the solar radiation, which is solar energy, it's being converted into chemical energy, right? So those chemical bonds hold the energy, which will then be released, and then some energy will be lost to respiration. So that's the first law of thermodynamics, which is manifested in the first trophic level. And then the second law of thermodynamics, you would see it across the chain, which is that as energy is transferred from one trophic level to the other, some of it will be lost in the form of respiration, in the form of F1s and D1s, and so on. And so I just like to insert it in, because then this model will get, for people who work more with numbers, and for people who like to look at that balance this way, that energy balance, it becomes really, really beautiful. And this is why, like I had mentioned it last time as well as this time, because we have more science people in the class as well. But it will be important for you to know it with this trophic level lens too. But yeah, that was the point of putting it there, for you to know that there's loss as we go from one trophic level to the other. But in environment, this movement across the food chain also has to do with pollution. So we're not just talking about the balance, but we're also talking about what if our environment has pollution? What happens to the species that remains at the topmost level of the food chain? So essentially, this particular paragraph, this particular graph or figure shows that as you go up the food chain, if there is a pollutant in the biosphere where the life resides, the life that will rely on it will also accumulate all of that. So as the fishes eat the smaller fishes, which eat the zooplanktons that live in the water, and they have, let's say, a smaller quantity of, I'll not say DDT, because So DDT stands for dichloroDiphenyl trichloroethane, I think. And then it's the, we know that it's used massively to spray to get rid of, for example, insects or in the case of malaria, the flies. But this has been banned, right? Like so many other pesticides. So let's say we sprayed a pesticide in a particular environment, and then that pesticide being ended up in the water body or a lake that was there. And then now we have that chemical accumulating across the food chain. And as you go higher up, the concentration of that pollutant will increase. And that concept is called biomagnification or bioaccumulation. So there's like another way, and environmentalists mostly look at it in great depths. And this is why we look at the heavy metal concentrations, the pesticide concentrations in the environment in greater details, because we want to know how that changes every species and how that impacts those balances that we naturally had in the environment. So like this is another way of looking at it. And like energy graph is thinning, so that pyramid is like thinning. In this case, you'll have the highest concentration at the topmost trophic level. So that's also like another way of looking at it. All right, so I think we've done a lot of discussion. I can quickly ask you to write in the chat box which one of these four, or which ones do you think have gone extinct? And I know one of them was in the Padlet as well. So you have some clues. So which one of these species do you think, or which of these species do you think have gone extinct? The rhino, yeah. Awesome. Yes, so the West, well, not awesome, but unfortunately, it's a great sorrow that I tell you that the West African rhinoceros and the Spix macaw, they have gone extinct. And although the flamingo and the red fox are endangered, they haven't gone extinct yet. They are endangered. We are endangering their habitat. So there we go. And then I told you that I'll keep bringing it back to you, right? To me, to all of us, and why we need to understand this. If you look at the causes of extinction, or if you look at the causes of being endangered, it's poaching, it's habitat loss, it's illegal trading, it's illegal trapping, it's construction of homes around their areas, it's domesticating them, and all of this is basically man-made problems. It's the problems that we have created for these species. And like I said, a lot of you said this extinction, and generally that's what climate change deniers or environmental science critics say as well, that naturally there was extinction. Yes, extinction was a part of the natural cycle, but everything we are doing is happening so quick. It's happening so fast. Everything's changing so fast. Those natural balances are being changed so fast by our species that it's no longer understandable. And that's why we're reading it and studying it and understanding it, right? Because we no longer understand those patterns. It's just happening very, very quickly. And so, for example, we look at the case of American alligator. In your book, you have the example of a shark. They have been here for millions of species. And in this 50 million year that we've been around as the powerful species, we have created rough conditions for almost all of them. So I think that's an important thing for us to think about, and then think about our actions as well. Roja, you have a question or a comment?
Seeing the Padlet, I saw that a lot of people had written about the mongoose, but this made me think about another animal which I didn't even know was found in Pakistan, the pangolins, which have become especially endangered. Like their numbers and populations have decreased after more Chinese people have come here, because it's used in Chinese medicine, and it's also consumed by them. So that population in the Sindh desert is declining very, very sharply since the CPEC.
Yeah, a lot of our needs, for example, the case of herbs and medicines and diverse food, and a certain kind of food which is very good for your health. Again, this is all human endeavors, or the human wants that have no end whatsoever. But a lot of it also is like luxury, right? If you look at, so, okay, in this case, like someone has convinced themselves that it's good for their health and that's why they need to go and look for a certain species for their own survival, right? So when I remember how I was telling you about us being the most powerful species. So look at how we are manipulating almost everything in the planet for our own well-being, because we want to survive, because we want to be protected. But a lot of it is not even that. So for example, the artifacts that you use that come from elephant tusks, like what reasons do we have to make an elephant suffer that much and take that tusk out of a live elephant, and sometimes even kill those elephants just because we could have that expensive artifact in our home? So people create a lot of arts around it and then they use it and it's being traded, and this has been like a long-lasting problem as well, which is why CITES, which is Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, was introduced, which we are a signatory to. Like I said, a lot of it is not just our food requirements. A lot of it is luxury. A lot of it is us becoming the center piece of this planet, and then us trying to destroy almost everything. But yeah, that's an important point, and those are the points that we have to remind ourselves in this particular class as well. But Earth's biodiversity can be genetic, it can be species-wise. So like I said, for us, look at the genetic diversity that human species holds. It's amazing. It's like I look at the diversity that we have, and then I always get so inspired with how diverse the planet is. And then you look at the species diversity. And for example, we talked about the species that haven't been discovered yet. And it would be so interesting to look at, all of them just manifesting themselves in the planet, and all of them surviving the planet, and for the planet to be healthy. And then that brings the ecological diversity, right? Diverse environments, life in the deepest pits of oceans or volcanoes, which is there, which exists, and that too is like really fascinating. And they have a role to play. Those species have a role to play in those particular environments, and that's also important. But there is a lot of functional diversity as well. So for example, we looked at the role of detrivores, and I cannot imagine our lives on the planet without the detrivores. So understanding that functional diversity, because that then makes the natural capital that we have, which is what all of us are here to remind ourselves. So this is just like a quick definition of all of those. So now we can come back to your Padlet again for the next 3-4 minutes. Some of you, all of you who posted about Indus River dolphin, you can talk about the Indus River dolphin. I will talk about the Beiji, which is a fresh water dolphin in China, I think in the Yangtze River, which got extinct, and it was one of the first ones, I think, to go extinct. And the story is really heartbreaking. I think sometimes, like I said, the bacteria, the viruses they survived, or they have survived for such a long time and are still surviving and making newer adaptations of species and modifying their genes to be able to survive more, because they have those shorter life cycles, right? For Beiji, for example, the age at which a particular species is able to reproduce, and then the reproduction cycle is really time taking. And also they are very they're not, because they've extincted. So they were a very classy species in a sense. They're very exclusive. They lived in very small groups, right? In a group of 6 to maybe 10, 15. And those kinds of species are not going to, these exclusive kind of species are not going to survive the planet, right? The more diverse, the more adapting, the more fitter ones are going to survive. So if your reproduction cycle is so slow and it takes time, when a new individual comes, the time that it takes to adapt is going to be very, very less. So in the case of this particular species, because like the human population was increasing around the river, there was a lot of noise. The locomotion that these water species use, that was impacted. They could no longer protect themselves from the predator, and so we ended up losing them, and they no longer live on the planet. But we will quickly come back to your Padlet on Indus River dolphin. I talked about the CITES, so let us quickly talk about this American alligator as well. So American alligator, for example, too, was a species that lied at the topmost level of the food web. And you just look at it and think, okay, what role does it have in my life? So it's found around wetlands, it did not allow invasive species to come in, so it was keeping the coast clear. It was forming a lot of ditches where water could remain in the areas during the times of droughts. But we started killing them because of the soft leather that would come out of it around the 1930s, and then by 1960, 90% of the population had gone down. But then they saw the impact of that. All of those roles that the species was playing in every other species that was residing in that ecosystem. When people understood that, we can't just remove them out of the ecosystem, because the predator fish, which eats all the other fishes, they eat those fishes. And because their population had gone down, the population of the predator fish had gone up. So automatically, like, there was lesser fish for the human population of species to enjoy. And all of those things only came for people to see when we had almost gotten rid of the population. So past that, then the conservation of the species started. And this particular role is called a keystone species. And I'll come back to the amphibians. So amphibians, or let's say the frogs in the case of my childhood in Gilgit, were a bioindicator species. They were an indicator of a natural cycle, healthy planet for them to survive. But as soon as that was changed, we no longer had those species. So the indicator species have gone away, and that's an indication that the environment is changing. In this case, a keystone species had gone away, and then a lot of things in the wetland ecosystem had changed. And then we tried to do conservation of that species. And that brings us to the conservation of biodiversity. You might also have seen a lot of environmentalists around you talk about the zoos, and then recently a lot of species might have been transported. So you saw the story of the elephant that was transported to Africa recently because we weren't taking care of it. COVID also, I think, made us realize that we can't keep organisms in captivity. When we were captive, when we had to be inside, it made us realize that in the name of conservation of biology, you cannot create these zoos or botanical gardens where you keep all of these animals, zoos in particular, where you keep them captive, and there's a lot of stress that they go through, and you're taking them away from their natural habitat. So that ex situ conservation is not that important. So outside of their home, like building a new home for them. But the botanical gardens have been very successful. So if I had to choose, I think I'll go more for the botanical gardens, because, or even seed banks, because you want to save seeds that have naturally evolved. So that's like one way of conserving biology, because now we're talking about how do us as the powerful species come back to saving these. But there's also a lot of in situ conservation of biodiversity. And that happens in national parks, in wildlife reserves, in sanctuaries, and all of these have different connotations to it. Some are more exclusive, you're not allowed there. Some are more inclusive, and the community is allowed to come and live together and coexist. But all of these came as a protected area standards in the IUCN list. And I've put some success stories. So just when I'd come back from the UK, I think I attended a UNDP event where they were celebrating the success of brown bear conservation, where they said that the population had really gone down to like 6 to 7. And when I'd just come back, they were saying that the population has increased again to at least a couple of dozens. And initially it was over 70, if I'm not wrong. And for ibex, like it's in my hometown is called the home of ibex. It's because when we, under the name of Conservation of Biodiversity and with the IUCN, when we introduced the no hunting policy and trophy hunting, we automatically, now like we have the ibex population so much that in winters, or in general, I think in spring as well, they come down to our fields and they come down and live like a fearless life. So I've seen the population increase as well. So some of the people who would put ibex as the threatened species, I think it has come out. I would like you to go back and see. I think at least in case of in the northern areas of Pakistan, I think we've taken it out of the endangered species list, at least for our area. So maybe you would like to look at them. Or there's no, like, nothing can describe the happiness that I get when I just look at, like, the therapy. It's so therapeutic to be looking at so many ibexes. I think it's very enriching, and I have our ancestors to thank for that, as well as the current generation that resides there that's not hunting them. But let's come back to, as I thank you for listening attentively to the class and for flooding the chat box. I love the energy that you show at 8 a.m. in the class. As we thank the natural capital, so like I said, I want you to be cognizant of what is around us and what role it's playing in our lives. All these insects, how they're adapting, how they are making our life easy, how they help pollination, how they help degradation. I think we owe them a big thank you. So I just want you to, with me, thank the insects around you. And with this, I think we can go back to, we can go to Zena for her question, and then we can go back to your Padlet and look at some of, like, have a little more discussion. But also, if you have any comments about the day, I wanted to finish my points earlier so that we'll have some discussion time for you guys to come in and speak. Yes, Zainab, we can take your point.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so it was kind of not like a question, but just a comment. So, like, what's the like, shouldn't we say sanctuaries are kind of paradoxical? Because the thing is, like, you are keeping them in captivity, but you're keeping them there for a good reason, so because they're babies or they'll be harmed by the wildlife. But then again, if they were in their wildlife or in their actual habitat, they would learn how to survive. So you're basically kind of not giving them the opportunity to grow as much or learn how to prey as much. So, like, for example, in the Naltar Wildlife Sanctuary, they have this like female snow leopard. And when you talk to the caretaker, he's like, okay, she's barely 7 years old. We have to wait for her to turn 16, and then we'll let her out of this enclosure. But then again, if you think about it, if she was outside with all of her other, like, fellow snow leopards, she would learn how to, you know, pray and do all the necessary things a leopard should learn how to do so. And she's kind of stopped from learning that much because of the restriction of her environment. So what's the environmentalist's outlook on sanctuaries like these?
Yeah, I think for me, and by the way, there's a backstory to this species that's now in Naltar. It was actually initially captured, I think, in Khunjarab, right, around Khunjarab, because that's where we kept it in captivity in a small cage. Basically, she got disconnected from her family. So her mother and all the other herds, I think when they were crossing the river, this baby was left behind, and so the locals took care of it. The local wildlife department took care of it. And at the time, we were all saying, you know, you can't train someone outside of their natural habitat. They have to be in their natural habitat, and that's exactly what happened when this species was eventually. I think her name was, I don't know. She had a beautiful name, but she was.
Lovely.
Pardon, say it again.
Her name is Lovely, also known as Lolly, I think.
Yeah, Lolly. I was going to say Dolly, but that would have been very wrong. But Lolly. So she is now being sent to. Sorry, I shouldn't be joking about it. But she's now in the Naltar Sanctuary. And at the time, like when my encounter in the Khunjarab, so they used to keep her in B, and my first encounter with this snow leopard was so exciting, right? She was literally a baby. At that time, but she was so angry. She was growling, and I could just imagine like how she would live in a life that's her own. Which, like, she would come to you and she would growl, and you could see how angry she is. But I was like always, I got fascinated by looking at, you know, how beautiful this creature is, and because we don't get to see them. So for us, like for example, in our culture, we call these species suchkum, which means that they only reside in the highest of lands that are more pure, and then lands that are away from human invasion. So for us, we don't have that close encounter with these species. And in our culture, we feel that they belong there. And if we bring, again, like they're those bioindicator species, that if we bring a lot of human intervention and population pollution somewhere, these species will leave and go even higher, right? So when the species was taken into, it was eventually released into Naltar once they thought they've trained it enough. But then because she had gotten used to living in the lowlands, which is not natural for those species, She got injured. I think she probably, of course, when she went there, she would have been new. And if you know, they also have like a culture. These snow leopards have areas that they do not let anyone else come in. You come into their area, they will fight you, right? So the moment this snow leopard was released into Naltar, she came back to the lowlands injured because she knew that no one would hurt her here because people had taken care of her in the grounds below. Whereas as soon as she was released into her natural habitat, which was away from her actual home, she came back injured. So I think that that's also like a story for us to learn, and we like to learn. Like we're not wed as environmentalists to the idea. I love the idea of building sanctuaries to keep or wildlife parks or national parks to keep humans from coming in and destroying the environment. But also, like, if that means taking them away from their homes, absolutely not, which is why I'm very skeptical of zoos and I do not support it at all. So yeah, like the answer to that would be definitely the closer they are to their home, the better, because like I said, this species came back and then they had to build like a bigger home for this species, for Lolly to survive. Anyone else? Someone else had raised their hand. Is it Misa?
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to ask, what are the other methods to conserve biodiversity? So we have studied the conservation of biodiversity in two forms, like national parks and zoos. Because if we see zoos and national parks cannot conserve every extinct species, they are more like species centered. So what are the other ways so that we can conserve whole ecosystem?
Yeah. Sorry, I just remembered that there was a slide on the bioindicator species and keystone species, which is not here, but I'll bring you back to it. So there are many ways. So if you look at the whole discussion that we've had today, you should be able to create your own answers for this. So we looked at some of the reasons for species extinction, right? The most obvious was habitat loss. So the first way of keeping them or conserving them or keeping them safe would be to make sure that their habitats are not lost. So whether that's like a coastline, so for example, last year we discussed a development project that was being conceptualized and has been approved for Karachi's mangroves, around Karachi's mangroves forests. And we talked about, how that would impact the species. Automatically, those sort of development projects means that we are compromising on a habitat for so many diverse species that have such critical roles to play. So I think for me, and for I think most of the environmentalists, it goes back to what you can do at the source. Like instead of building sanctuaries, instead of building zoos, can we go back and keep their homes safe? Even if we are around them, can we just make sure that we coexist, that we live in harmony, that we're not damaging their homes? So for me, like the first step would be keeping their home safe. So stopping habitat destruction. And then, of course, like for example, for some species, we've come down to the point where it's no longer possible. So for example, if you look at panda, right, we'd come down to the last pair. So it was important that we bring them back to the lab, to more, to conditions that we could monitor. It was no longer about letting them just there, because we had to make sure that, they breed, they reproduce. And so they were brought back. So I think there are also cases where what I'm saying could be compromised on, like, or will have a total contradictory narrative. But whatever is good for the species, and I think it would depend on the case. So in some cases, for example, reducing hunting, introducing the concept of trophy hunting, or no hunting, reducing the trade, illegal trade in particular, because people make a lot of money out of this. People who have those kind of luxuries are happy to come. So maybe now I can ask the person who'd written about Hubara Bustard to come in and speak about what do you think is happening there. We're almost there, almost done.
Ma'am, I wrote about the Biobastion. So the thing is, they're actually being hunted by the Arabs and the Sheikhs, and they're actually granted permission, and they come and hunt them in thousands. And the reason we are given is that they're actually being the money to actually stop them from being endangered. but it's just that it's a political move and we just turn a blind eye to it. And they actually do it for trophy hunting, and they actually hunt in such a huge number that they actually just come to Pakistan to hunt these birds, and that is the reason they are getting extinct. And also the illegal trafficking is also something that is making them going extinct. And I know for a fact that people also love its meat, and even though it's banned, I've seen it dead in front of my eyes as well, and I was so horrified by the fact that even though with such strict measures and stuff, people still get fired and get access to such a. It's very painful to watch that. So this was something that I wanted everyone to know.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting that up. And maybe I can quickly, I know we're almost above time. So maybe I can take, I want to take Behram because he's been my silent assistant in the chat box, giving a lot of useful info.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ma'am, I just want to ask, can we go for the cloning method? I know there are ethical issues with it, and the clones do not survive for so long, but can we go for that option in case if a species is getting endangered and extinct? It just come up in my mind.
Yeah, so it depends, right? Like I said, we can have conflicting views on this. So I told you that I'm a pro habitat conservation person, but I also understand when it comes down to the point where you only have like one pair left and you bring them in the lab and you bring them in the sanctuary and you work on them and their survival. About GMO, I have kind of the same feeling, but then when it comes to climate change adaptation, my views change. So for example, I believe in purity and I believe in natural evolution. And this is my own personal view. And if you go online, you will see plenty of contradictory views. So for me, I think it's important because the species evolve naturally. So the seed that, for example, our mothers save from the previous produce and then use in the next harvest or sowing season, it's naturally evolving. It is seeing the weather patterns, and a lot of information can be inferred about the weather patterns, about what those seeds have seen from there as well. So it's scientifically a beautiful phenomenon to keep that system running. But like I said, we are changing the environment at a pace that it's no longer, the seeds can no longer adapt and the seeds can no longer evolve. And so if suddenly there's a pest attack, if suddenly there's a disease that attacks it. So for example, with COVID, look at how instantly we acted, right? We knew, we were ready, we were, so many people instantly started working on the vaccines. We cannot say the same for the plant species or the animal species that live there. And so automatically, if we want, particularly in terms of food security, I think I have mixed opinions. And when we talk about food production, food security, we'll talk about genetic modification. And I wouldn't say I'm entirely against it, because the GMOs that are being produced, the inspiration for that is also taken from nature. So for example, if in nature there was a species that would go dormant when there was drought, and then would thrive again when there was more water, how it would fight the pest, how it would fight certain environmental conditions. So that inspiration is actually taken from nature as well. But I do have mixed opinion about it. I personally like the purist theory, and I like for things to evolve naturally. But I do think we've reached a point where we have to be innovative for our survival. And then all of this goes back to like our survival, right? So cloning, like, I don't know, I think with both technology and biology, I have ethical issues with creating clones for the sake of creating clones. Or for example, creating robots for the sake of creating robots. But as long as we know it's critical and it will not damage the species other than us, that it will not drastically change things for the entire biosphere, because biodiversity is an important indication of a healthy planet. So as long as that is not being compromised on, I think I can adjust my ethical values, but personally, not in favor of it that much. Yeah. So we can end it there.
Thank you.
For those of you who want to leave, please feel free to leave. And this applies to everyone and every role in the class. But if anyone has a question, you can stay back. And we'll. By the way, I think Rosham should send you a survey soon, in which she will ask you a few questions about the class in general. please participate in it so that we have full participation. And then we wanted to make a few changes as well, but also for us, like feedback for us to how much more should we engage as TAs and as faculty with you, and how much time do you have. But yeah, thank you so much for participating in the class. I'll go back and read the chat again and come back if there is anything important, but goodbye to those who want to leave, and then those who want to stay, you're welcome to stay.